Hello, I'm Katty Kay. I'm a British journalist in Washington, D.C. with the BBC World Service. I've lived in America for more than 20 years.
And I'm Carlos Watson. I'm a journalist and entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, California. I deliver news to America through a media company that I helped to co-found called OZY.
And together we'll be bringing you When Katty Met Carlos.
You know I love that name, Katty, and I would love if the folks listening would join us not just this week, but each week for the next 7 weeks as we try to get past some of the noise of the daily headlines and really grapple with some of what you and I both believe are these profound forces that are shaping not just the U.S., but the world around us, sometimes at blinding speed.
So every week we're going to pick a different theme and we're going to use it to try and explore and explain what's going on here in America. Apart from the presidential election on November the 3rd, people across this country, they're having to cope with a ton of stuff going on. There's the fractured economy, riots on the streets, fires on the West Coast, hurricanes on the East Coast. I'm sure I've forgotten something. Oh yes, there happens also to be a deadly pandemic.
Yeah, as you and I have talked about, there are moments where 1 minute you're talking about the death of a Supreme Court justice like RBG, another moment you're talking about changes in the pandemic, yet another moment you're talking about another moment of racial reckoning here in the U.S. It is tough to get a hold of all the things that are happening and to really try to understand where things are going. But I hope that what we are doing here will allow people some broader perspective, some more in-depth perspective, and do so in a really vibrant way.
And we're going to have conversations with guests too, guests we want to talk to and hang out with, and we hope you'll enjoy meeting them as well.
Indeed.
This week, the United States hit a momentous and entirely unwanted milestone. It became the first country in the world to record more than 200,000 deaths from COVID-19. The disease has exposed fault lines that run through American society. They were present before the pandemic, but they've become much plainer for everybody around the world to see now. The richest country in the world has simply struggled to cope.
Indeed, this became tragically obvious as the healthcare system struggled with the influx of critically ill and highly infectious patients. Things like critical PPE, the kind of personal protective equipment that so many of our nurses and doctors and others needed, has been in shockingly short supply. And we've seen incredible, sometimes heart-wrenching things like nurses wrapping themselves in bin bags, which are effectively homemade attempts at protective medical gear. Indeed, the situation has forced doctors to make decisions that I think many never expected to face in America. Take a listen to this.
I'm Dr. Natasha Kathuria. I'm an emergency medicine doctor and a global health specialist, and I work in Texas. We had a patient who they called a code on, which means that the patient either lost pulses or was, no longer responsive. I left the ER, I went up to the ICU to respond, and at that point we were, kind of in the middle of all of this, struggling with PPE shortages. We didn't have sufficient masks. We were reusing our masks. We have to wear very different gear when we intubate to protect us because it's arguably our highest risk procedure for contracting the virus. You're suctioning airway particles, there's virus pretty much just being thrown around, and you're also trying to work within a very, very short time frame to put a tube in the patient's airway to protect them and save their life. And I realized when I ran up to the code that they didn't have the proper mask for me to wear because they were short. I only had the surgical mask that I was wearing. It was very difficult. You have to make a spur-of-the-moment decision. Do I put my life at risk and intubate this patient? At that time, we didn't know if the patient had COVID. We didn't have rapid testing. We had no idea. So I was very nervous and anxious. And, at that point, you got to make a decision. Do I save this guy's life or do I protect myself and say, no, I'm not going to intubate this patient until I have protection, knowing that that would lead the patient to die in front of you. It's not a decision I think any doctor would do any differently than myself, which is, all right, I'm going to intubate this patient and cross my fingers and hope that I don't get COVID and this patient doesn't have COVID, which I did. The patient was intubated. We resuscitated the patient, transferred him to the ICU. He was saved for the time being, and I was able to go back down to the ER. Luckily, that we don't think the patient had COVID at that time. Again, we didn't have testing then. That patient never got tested. Unfortunately, he passed away within 24 hours of that incident. I was fine. I didn't have COVID. And so I got really lucky in that situation. But, a lot of our colleagues around the country didn't get lucky in situations like that. And that was very terrifying. That was the first time I was legitimately appalled that I was even in a situation like that and that this was happening in America after we'd already been through this pandemic for months. Those are just moments where, you feel this level of fear that never before have we have to fear our own health by treating a patient. And it eats at us at night. It scares us. We are all terrified of what's to come, with continued struggles with feeling confident over our PPE supply, knowing that this pandemic is far from over. I've worked in 11 different countries, developing countries, and I've had to deal with shortages of everything. We're not used to that in America. We are the leaders of the free world. We have money. We're supposed to be setting the bar for healthcare. And we hope to set the bar for a lot of things in the world. We hope to be doing everything right and the best. And this was a really crazy moment for physicians to see firsthand how we're not leading this fight. And we didn't protect our front lines the way that we thought our government and our country would.
Listening to Dr. Natasha Kathuria tell her story, we're struck by the bravery that she and her fellow healthcare workers have displayed as the pandemic has swept across the country.
And it's just one of the many stories that we've heard, which has led the two of us to wonder, has COVID-19 humbled America?
And we're excited that we're going to be having these profound conversations with really intriguing guests. One of the first ones to join us will be the former Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, who's talking to us from his home.
And the New York Times' Pentagon correspondent, Helene Cooper. So thank you both for joining us on this new podcast to look at this question of how America is faring in this moment, whether America has been humbled in this moment and how it's dealing with the coronavirus. Senator Flake, let me start with you. There was a recent Pew poll that showed people around the world trust Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping more than they trust President Trump. How does that make you feel about where America is right now in the eyes of the rest of the world?
Yeah, I saw that poll, and it's extremely disheartening. And I hope that it's not true, but I fear that it is. I think our handling of the pandemic, certainly our dismantling of alliances. I don't know how anybody could have the same view of us as they did just a few years ago.
Helene, do you see that poll and feel like America has been humbled, or is that just one more piece of data and America continues as she's been before?
Well, I think I'm still stuck on this whole idea of humbled because the word implies sort of shame. Certainly, Donald Trump doesn't feel humbled and his supporters don't feel humbled. I think you're not going to see a lot of humility there. I think certainly the critics of Trump feel that the United States has lost its prestige around the world, that there's a certain puncturing in this whole aura of American exceptionalism. But as an American, I look at this country still kind of as an ideal that a lot of us have strived for. So I'm struggling a little bit with the humble word.
I'm not thinking about President Trump, really, when I'm thinking about this notion of being humbled. I'm thinking about the country and whether the coronavirus exposed fault lines in America that were already there. When we see pictures of nurses wearing trash bags because they don't have PPE, that strikes me as a great power that has been humbled. Senator, does that ring any bells to you?
Yeah, that's extremely troubling to see. We have slipped, and I don't think that this is permanent. We will get it back. It may be seen as an aberration a few years from now, but right now, certainly, I think the world sees us differently. And I think a lot of Americans, we see ourselves a bit differently as well. Other countries have handled this better, let's be frank. And we're not used to that happening.
What I find really interesting about what coronavirus has done for the United States and its image abroad is I think it's as if COVID-19 is the worst possible disease for the United States because the United States is all about individual liberty. It's one of those things that people here really pride. That's sort of the worst possible thing you need for fighting COVID because it's all about, community good and the community coming together. It's not about individual liberty at this point. We put on masks to take care of others. That's kind of designed almost precisely to cause a schism in this country, which is so much about individual liberty.
I think America is robust as a country, and I think that's its great strength. Here's the weakness that I almost hesitate to say, living as a Brit in America. It's the kind of thing that I'm conscious can get people's, hackles up a bit. I have never lived in a country, and I've lived in 11 different countries in 5 different continents. I've never lived in a country where people say as often, this is the greatest country in the world. And it strikes me that in some ways, that concept has stopped America from learning. And that reluctance to learn has been there for a long time, particularly on an issue like healthcare, when the moment you raise the prospect of a European type model, which is a mixture of private and public, you're condemned for wanting America to become socialist. But coronavirus has exposed it even more because we could have learned. We could have learned from Italy or China or Europe. But the moment you try to say to people we should learn, that kind of runs counter to the notion that this is the greatest country in the world. I mean, de facto, if you're the greatest country in the world, you have nothing to learn, right? And that's what worries me a little bit, is that this self-image stops America from becoming, paradoxically, greater. Senator, does that ring any bells?
Yeah, and I think you can hold that thought and still believe that our country is the greatest in the world. but we still can learn and should learn. And we, not just on healthcare issues, but, you look at some countries and how they've dealt with structural budget deficits. We could learn from them. We're going to need to learn from them because we've got a whopper right now with a $3 trillion deficit this year. And yeah, I think that attitude does keep us sometimes from learning lessons that we could learn. But things change with administrations, and I think the world is certainly hoping that America can provide leadership in areas that it has provided leadership before. In particular, these alliances that we've put together that have kept the peace and have led to prosperity. And so I do think that we are in a bad way right now, but it doesn't have to last.
Helene, one of the things I wonder about on this topic of humility and learning from other countries is I wonder if there's a generational aspect to it. Because when I think about the Gen Z and millennials in my life, I think their music, their food, the kind of shows they watch, the time they spend on YouTube, TikTok, etc., they very much are borrowing from people all around the globe. And they do it easily and naturally, and they don't even think of it as a thing. And I wonder if this is more of a generational issue. Does this feel to you like we have a way more global Gen Z and millennial group?
I hope so. I think there's some truth in what you're saying. I mean, definitely with the boomers. This conversation is a little strange for me because I feel both defensive and as an American, and I also feel like hypercritical. I'm an American by choice. I'm a naturalized American citizen, and I am well aware of the fact that there's no other country on earth that I could have moved to as an African, as a Liberian refugee at the age of 14 with basically nothing, and made it to where I'm now the Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times. If my family had run away from Liberia and ended up anywhere else, my story could not have happened. And so a lot of that knowledge fuses the love I have for the United States. But I'm also well aware of the fact that Americans have this whole idea we're the best country in the world and we're the this and we're the that. It's so American and it can be so off-putting. That's the problem. I think Katty made a really good point when she talked about this inability to be able to learn from other countries. And I think it can end up, this becomes hubris.
Senator, when you were living in Zimbabwe, actually you and I share something. I lived in Zimbabwe too. You were there in the early 80s. I was there in the late 80s. What was it like then, back in the 80s, to be an American, a young American man abroad?
Well, it was interesting. During the 80s, we were right in the midst of the Cold War. Our foreign policy was defined by, particularly in the African countries, trying to woo countries away from the Soviet influence, and the Soviet Union was doing the same. I spent a year in the country of Namibia, the year that Namibia gained its independence from South Africa. The Berlin Wall came down at the same week that Namibia had its elections. And at that time, boy, to be an American abroad and to see, some people called it the end of the history, that we had won, that the world was over in terms of conflict. It of course wasn't, but that was a heady time to be an American abroad. And I remember the emotions I had at that time to see the gratitude around the world for what the United States had done during the Cold War. To be an American abroad, boy, it was one to be very proud of your country. Certainly, it was quite a time to be in Africa.
Let's fast forward to today, because Africa is an interesting case, right? I mean, Helene, you know this too from Liberia. Actually, Africans have a choice now, and back then in the 1980s, they made the choice of the United States. Today, increasingly, Africans have a choice, and they're looking to China.
That is definitely the worrying thing. I was in Botswana just a while after the president had made his famous S-hole country comment, and talked to our ambassador there. And he mentioned that I think 4 ambassadors from around the African continent were called into their heads of state office. The head of state called them in and basically asked them, do you feel you're serving in an S-hole country? It's been painful, frankly, to see us withdraw and to see China in many ways fill that vacuum now.
The Chinese part is, I think, so interesting because I think in many ways it's not necessarily a question of choosing the Chinese system. I don't think African countries are choosing the Chinese governing system at all, but I think it's just a question of the Chinese are there all over Africa. You go to any of these African countries and the Chinese are there in huge numbers. When I was growing up in Liberia, I remember going up country once and there was a white teenage girl and we would say white girl as a kid. And then a few years ago, I was in Liberia with a Greek friend of mine, and we went up country, and all these kids came running up to her from town to town to town, and they would see her and they would point and say, Chinese lady, Chinese lady. Because in Liberia now, where the white looks like Chinese, they assume anybody white is Chinese because that's who's there. Americans are not there. And that's kind of the shift I've seen all across the continent, is that you look at who's there and who's not.
Helene, you said earlier that your story only could have happened in the U.S. And let me just push on that for a second, because one of the interesting experiences I've had in the last couple of years is being in China, being there with people who were born in China, came to the U.S., got top flight educations here at many of our best institutions, and the kinds of students who years ago would have stayed in the U.S. and fought to stay were actually saying there are better opportunities for me in China. And I remember that was a mind blower. So have you bought into a narrative that the U.S. is the only place where your story could have worked, or could your story have worked elsewhere?
I don't think so. I still hold to and I'll keep to it till my dying day. I still hold to my feelings that it could only work here. I look at Europe and yeah, we're starting to see a little bit more, but I don't think at this point that the UK or Scandinavia has anything on the United States when it comes to the ability to come here with nothing and to be able to make yourself.
But okay, I don't want to be Debbie Down. I'm starting to feel like, the Brit who's raining on the parade here. But actually, Helene, when you look at the numbers, there is more social mobility in Europe at the moment than there is here in the United States. There's even more social mobility in the country that I come from, in the UK, which has a class system that looks like, some stratified geological layer of the Grand Canyon. It's so complex. But just in terms of social mobility, it's not true that America is the place where you can move as much as you can in other countries now.
Katty,
Okay.
I think that's well, no, but
I mean, I just think it's sort of this. It's one of the myths about America that isn't true at the moment, and I think it could be true again. But it is kind of a myth.
Well, I love the conversation because I do think that social mobility is the American dream and is the American promise. But this also turns you and me to another topic that you and I have been thinking a lot about, which is the death of former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who also became known affectionately as the notorious RBG.
Love that name.
Yeah, what a great name, huh? It brought her to a whole generation of people who came to admire her, to know her story, and really to appreciate the impressive work that she and many others did on a variety of questions of fairness, including questions around gender. And where we are now, of course, is that not only are people missing her and missing her contribution to the legal establishment, but there's also a larger question about the political battle for dominance of the Supreme Court.
Well, let's throw that one to Senator Flake. Having been somebody who has been right at the heart of judicial nomination processes for Supreme Court justices, we couldn't have a better person.
Well, I just hope that we can return to a time where Supreme Court justices are confirmed 96-3. I think was her case in the 1990s. But I think it is emblematic of the distance we've come. But also, we ought to note that she dragged us part of that way. And people like her who are willing to, get in the fray and stick to it. We owe a lot to them. And I think that if you see the reaction to her death, particularly by young people, young women, has been just incredible to see because they know that people like that are responsible for us being in the place that we're in today. But it's going to be a battle.
Helene, what do you think about RBG's legacy and her passing?
I think there are two different strains. There's the reeling, this feeling of loss. Because she was such an iconic figure. She was so important to so many young women and so many women, period. And then there's this fear, I think, that you can't not have when you're living in the United States today, which is that feels like it's on the verge of precipitating a civil crisis.
Helene, one question. You mentioned something early on about individualism and community. And I wonder whether you have hope that fundamental sense of community can be rebuilt. And Senator Flake, do you too?
I hope it can, but it's just become such a partisan thing. How did we get to the point where wearing a mask to protect an elderly person who you might come into contact with is like a blue versus red issue? That seems crazy. We've managed to politicize everything. And until that kind of goes away, how do you rebuild? How do you come back to this idea of community?
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be difficult to get back to. And the politicalization of the mask issue. When I read Facebook posts of people being proud that they went to Walmart and refused to wear a mask and that they encourage others to do the same, to stand up for yourself, it's difficult. Right now, the better angels of our nature have been silenced, I think, but they can emerge again.
So I'm actually known as a glass half full person, not a glass half empty person, this conversation notwithstanding. So let's end. I just want to ask both of you what do you feel optimistic about?
What do I feel optimistic about? That's a tough one. I think this is still a country with an enormous amount of potential and hope, and it's a place that can regain its footing in a way that very few places can quickly because of the dynamism of the people here.
Yeah, we've been through worse before. We haven't faced this exact situation, but we've been through far worse before, and we've endured it, and we can get back.
I love you guys hearing both of those, and I'm an optimist by nature. I'm the son of optimists. I'm the son of teachers, grandson of teachers. So I come to optimism easily, for better or for worse. And as I said at the outset, I think not only this conversation, but I think there have been a whole set of creative posts on social media Helene and Senator Flake, I don't know if you guys have seen them, but it's New Yorkers talking about the fact that many wealthier New Yorkers have left the city. And instead of saying, boo-hoo, they're gone, they said, fine, there's more room for us. That every time people abandon us, the more creative we get. And we create disco, and we create hip-hop, and we create, the fashion industry. And I loved that kind of entrepreneurial energy. I'm still a believer that that energy is there and that it's around the globe. We will leave it there, but Helene, Senator Flake, thank you both.
Senator, thank you. Helene, thank you.
Hey, thank you all.
So, Carlos, I want to get your thoughts on that conversation, which I found fascinating. I hate the fact that I have now become the voice of doom and gloom on When Katty Met Carlos, because I'm really not. Even though I have a name that suggests I must have been a horrible child, I am not Katty. I'm a nice person. So I want to get your thoughts in a second, but first of all, I want to ask you about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because you had the honor of meeting her back in the 1990s. What was she like?
Well, let's see. Years ago, as a young man, I was a law student looking for a summer job, and I managed to get a job in the White House, in the White House counsel's office. And one of the first assignments they gave me was there was a new opening on the court. And when President Clinton ultimately chose Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or as a Southern senator at the time, Strom Thurmond used to call her, Judge Ginsburg, and I can still hear him saying that. Part of my job, which seems ridiculous in retrospect, was to help prep her. And so I would go to the Senate as she spoke before the Senate. And during the lunch breaks, I and one other person on our team who was working with her would sit back in the room. But she didn't want to talk to us. She didn't want to prep. She didn't want to do any more homework. What she wanted to do was sit with her husband, Marty. And they sat and they held hands, Katty. And Katty, you can't make this up. They just held hands, and they would hold hands what felt like the whole lunchtime long. It was kind of a special love story kind of unfolding in front of your eyes. And so, but meeting Judge, soon-to-be Justice Ginsburg, soon-to-be the notorious RBG, soon-to-be the glorious RBG, may she rest in peace, was a treat.
That actually brought tears to I'm a sap. My children will tell you that, I can watch a Kleenex ad on television and start crying. But that did bring tears to my eyes. So let me do a kind of elegant Carlos Watson-esque turn here. That notion of having people's back, I thought was one of the most interesting things that came out of this conversation. And maybe it's fundamental, and maybe it's also the source of optimism going forward. And I thought what Helene said there about how that has somehow crumbled in this time of COVID, that, the fierce individualism of America and that longing for freedom and individual rights has kind of clashed up against a virus where we need a sense of community and protection of community. But I do feel fundamentally in America that community is what this country is about. And I think that sense of community and that sense of enjoying people's successes and looking after people in times of success is a great and powerful force that this country has going for it. It's probably what makes me most optimistic that America will come out of this, let's face it, it's not a political thing to say. It's not a biased thing to say. This is a hard moment, but the country will come out of it.
Yeah, you've chosen a much more elegant phrase, hard moment. Here they would say a dumpster fire, or they would use more colorful language. But I
work for the BBC.
Right. But yes, I think that there's a rich vibrancy to our communities. And to be honest, even though, as you said, there is a political polarization at the moment, one could also look upon the last 6 to 8 months and people cheering for essential workers and people donating to support keeping certain restaurants alive and people doing other things. Some of my neighbors for the first time coming over to say hello and to check on each other, say hello at a safe distance, but still say hello in ways that maybe we didn't, walking around the neighborhood, maybe in ways that we didn't before. Maybe there's goodness in what comes. We
hope you've enjoyed this first episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. And we hope that you'll join us in conversation again next week when we'll be talking about race and ask how race relations in America will get any better. Certainly this topic has become fresh once again with the decision in the case of Breonna Taylor, a young black woman in Kentucky who was shot and killed in her home. And recently, none of the police were charged with shooting her, and that's created a fair amount of unrest. So, Katty, I think we will end up having quite a conversation about possibilities for racial improvement and racial change in the country.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that conversation. It's not an easy one to have in this country, and we hope that we can go a little bit further, a bit more frankly. Honestly, it might be difficult, but it's a conversation that needs having.
You know, one of the things, just to tease people a little bit, Katty, that I'm glad that we are doing is not only welcoming voices from within America to discuss race and race relations here, but I think getting a little global perspective on it, I think is going to be valuable as well. And I'm excited about some of the folks who will join us to make this conversation rich and vibrant and valuable.
Carlos, that is what is called a tease in broadcasting.
Indeed. Until next time.